to today's Brill Pre-concert talk. My name is Katie Brill. I'm the Associate Artistic Administrator of the Aspen Music Festival and School, and it's my pleasure to introduce today's concert program featuring conductor Rafael Piare, cellist Elisa Weiberstein, and the Aspen Festival Orchestra. The opening piece on the program is by composer William Grant Still. If you're not familiar with him, Still was born in Mississippi, raised in Arkansas, studied at a historically black college and university, and then later Oberlin College, then moved to New York City in 1919. He led the Los Angeles Philharmonic in a concert of his own compositions at the Hollywood Bowl in 1936, making him the first African American to conduct a major symphony orchestra. He became the first African American composer to have an opera produced by a major company when the New York City Opera presented Troubled Island in 1949. He was also the first to have a symphony performed by a major orchestra, and the first to see one of his operas televised on a national network. The piece on today's program, called Darker America, is the first orchestral work he ever wrote. The composer himself wrote a description of what's going on in this piece, and there's a lot to unpack in here, so I'll interrupt the quote to play samples of what he's describing as we go. Quote, "Darker America, as its title suggests, is representative of the American Negro. His serious side is presented and is intended to suggest the triumph of a people over their sorrows through fervent prayer. At the beginning, the theme of the American Negro is announced by the strings. Following a short development, the English horn announces the sorrow theme. Which is followed immediately by the theme of hope, given to muted brass, accompanied by string and woodwind. The sorrow theme returns, treated differently, indicative of more intense sorrow, as contrasted to passive sorrow, indicated at the initial appearance of the theme. Again, hope appears, and the people seem about to rise above their troubles, but sorrow triumphs. Then the prayer is heard. the prayer of numbed rather than anguished souls. Strongly contrasted moods follow, leading up to the triumph of the people near the end, at which point the three principal themes are combined, end quote. You may also notice that overall, Darker America sounds a little bit jazzy. This was one of many pieces written in 1924 that incorporated elements of jazz, another big example being Gershwin's Rhapsody in Blue. Next on the program is Dvorak's Cello Concerto in B minor, one of the most frequently performed cello concerti today. Dvorak was obviously not an American composer, but he worked for 3 years as director of the National Conservatory of Music of America in New York. His cello concerto was the last piece Dvorak wrote while in the US. By this point, he was ready to go back to his home and family in Bohemia, both of which he dearly missed. Dvorak was skeptical about the cello as a solo instrument with orchestra until he heard the premiere of a cello concerto written by his colleague at the conservatory named Victor Herbert. Some of you may know of Victor Herbert because he was principal conductor of the Pittsburgh Symphony from 1898 to 1904. Dvorak was impressed with Herbert's use of the cello's upper register, and he liked Herbert's use of free trombones to accompany the soloist in the second movement. Dvorak does similar things in his own cello concerto. Free trombones in a cello concerto were already unusual at the time, but Dvorak doesn't just add free trombones. He also adds a tuba, piccolo, and triangle, widening the range and expressive possibilities of the full orchestra. He avoids balance issues between soloist and orchestra by sometimes having the solo cello accompany the orchestra, or sometimes by having orchestra players play soloistic parts while the cello isn't playing at all, and of course, by having lighter orchestration while the cello is playing. He ties it all together when the orchestra echoes something that the soloist just played, or vice versa. The overall effect is it sounds like a dialogue between soloist and orchestra. But what makes Dvorak's cello concerto so memorable is the singable tunes he writes throughout the piece. The first movement focuses mainly on 2 contrasting melodies. The first melody is introduced by the woodwinds at the beginning. This theme develops, the second melody is introduced by the horn. In comparison to the first theme, the second sounds more lyrical, a little bit happier, and very smooth. Introductory section sets up the solo cello for a big entrance. When the cello comes in about 4.5 minutes into the first movement, it plays the 2 melodies from the orchestral introduction. The orchestra plays in the original key of B minor here, while the solo cello plays in the key of B major. Equally dramatic, but it makes the sound a little bit brighter. After that develops, the cello then plays the second theme the exact same way that the orchestra did in the introduction. The middle section of the second movement is based on a song Dvorak wrote in 1888, Opus 82, number 1. The title translates to, "Leave Me Alone." The song was a favorite of his sister-in-law, Josephina, who he'd been in love with before he ended up marrying her sister. While he was writing his cello concerto, Dvorak received word that Josephina was ill, and so he wanted to pay tribute to her in this piece by including the song. Here's what the original song sounds like. And here's what it sounds like in the cello concerto, played by the soloist and then by the flute. Hear the reference to this song come back one more time toward the end of the third movement. The third movement sounds almost like rhythmic folk music. The main musical idea in this movement is played by the cello after a short orchestral introduction. You'll hear this tune come back a few times. At the end of the concerto, the orchestra gradually gets quieter until the piece ends with a few last bursting chords. You will notice right away that Dvorak's cello concerto is written in a completely different musical style than the last piece on this concert, Sergei Prokofiev's Fifth Symphony. Prokofiev 5 was written in the summer of 1944, but I'd like to back up a couple of decades first, just to describe some of how political and cultural forces might have affected the way that Prokofiev wrote this symphony. Prokofiev left Russia in 1917 after the Russian Revolution. Specifically, he moved to Paris, but he also did a tour of the United States. 8 years later, the USSR started pressuring expat composers, including Prokofiev, to return to their home country. A few different factors contributed to his decision to ultimately return in 1933, though he was a little bit reluctant to do so. First, he was frustrated that he was having trouble getting his music performed outside of Russia. Second, he increasingly relied on Russian sources of income, and there came a point when Soviet authorities threatened to cut off his financial support if he didn't return. There was a brutal crackdown on perceived enemies within the Soviet Union in the 1930s, and this personally affected Prokofiev. A theater director, who was a friend of Prokofiev's, disappeared during this time, and the director's wife was found dead, having been stabbed in the eyes. Shortly after this happened, Prokofiev was forced to write a cantata in celebration of Joseph Stalin's 60th birthday in 1938. But the national focus shifted when World War II started. Prokofiev was held up as a cultural propaganda tool and was awarded the Stalin Prize for his 7th piano sonata. In other words, audiences eagerly looked forward to the premiere of Prokofiev's Fifth Symphony. So this brings us back to 1944. While the war was still going on, the Soviet Composers Union arranged for composers to stay at a resort away from the active war zones so they could continue to work. This is where Prokofiev was when he wrote Symphony No. 5, which he finished composing in 1 month. If I was going to pick one word to describe this symphony, it would be unsettling. And Prokofiev uses many different compositional techniques to make it sound unsettling. For one thing, he doesn't dwell on a melody for very long, so you really have to stay on your toes as a listener. Let's dive into the first movement as an example. The beginning opens with a pleasant-sounding tune played by woodwinds. Of course, the pleasantries don't last very long. While this first tune is played several times by different sections of the orchestra throughout the movement, it's manipulated in different ways to make it feel like something is wrong. In the opening section of the first movement, this is maybe 60 seconds into the first movement, the low brass and low strings play this two-note motif that really doesn't blend with what everyone else is doing. Here's what they're playing. And it creates a creepy undercurrent when you put the two together. The next time you hear the original tune clearly is about 4 minutes into the first movement when it's played by the cellos and basses. This time, the violins and violas play tremolo, or rapidly repeated notes that sound a little bit like quivering. That turns into triplets, which then turns into this little motif. The jumping off point for a short section that races along, and here's a snippet of that. the brass about 8 minutes in, and it keeps getting tossed around the sections of the orchestra as the sound gets louder and louder. Bottom line, this tune ends up always sounding a little too loud, or a little too fast, or in combination with the rest of the orchestra, a little too dissonant. It just doesn't sit comfortably. To top it all off, the movement ends with a couple of very strange chords, followed by a totally normal sounding B-flat major chord that feels like a very sudden arrival in context. In the second movement, Prokofiev experiments a lot with tempo and rhythm. The first section feels extremely speedy, with the strings in particular playing what seems like a never-ending run of short 8 notes. Here's a little of what that sounds like. About 3 minutes before the strings can finally take a breath. Then a middle section starts. The woodwinds lead the transition into this section, which you can easily feel in a 1-2-3, 1-2-3 rhythm. The clarinet and bassoon are featured here, and this clip starts with a little bit of the transition material and then goes into the middle section. The transition music comes back, and then the brass start a new section of short 8th notes. It feels slower than the running 8th notes in the beginning, but it eventually accelerates back to the return of the extremely speedy first section, and it stays that fast all the way to the end of the movement. The third movement is slow, connected, and a little bit heavy. It seems like it's supposed to function as the lyrical movement of the whole symphony, except that there are many things that, again, make it sound ominous. The first thing is the almost melodies, and what I mean by that is you hear different themes in the orchestra that could be melodies, except that the notes jump around a lot, making it impossible to sing those themes. Here's one that the woodwinds play at the beginning of the movement. And here's one played by the oboes a couple of times in the movement. You may also notice that the first violins spend a lot of time in the highest register of their instrument, which is the register where the instrument can easily sound like it's shrieking. Here's a little sample of that. About 8 minutes into the third movement, the tempo gets a little more animated and the orchestra swells to fortissimo. It's dark and it's intense. This movement has eerily quiet sections too, and it ends very quietly. Early on in the fourth movement, we hear an echo of the original tune from the first movement. Followed by a racing tempo that rivals the tempo of the second movement. Then about 5 minutes in, the strings introduce a completely new theme that sounds melodic and almost happy until we get back to the racing tempo, and now this time you can hear this new theme integrated with what the orchestra was playing before. In short, the fourth movement has a lot of sudden changes of character. And then it's a total frenzy of notes all the way to the end of the piece. Prokofiev described his Fifth Symphony as, quote, a work about the spirit of a man, end quote. But listening to this piece, it's hard to imagine that's all there is to it. And I haven't even mentioned yet what happened at the premiere. When the Fifth Symphony premiered in January 1945, Prokofiev himself conducted, but right before he was about to start the performance, literally, he was holding the baton in the air, about to give the first cue, when celebratory cannon fire went off outside the concert hall. The Soviet army had defeated the Germans in battle on the Vistula River, which was the last major battle of World War II on Russian soil. When it comes to recordings, there aren't many available of the William Grant still. The one I referenced for this talk was made by the River Oaks Chamber Orchestra. But the good news is there are a ton of recordings available for the Dvorak and Prokofiev. Yo-Yo Ma has performed the Dvorak so many times that you could pick your favorite from all the different versions of just his recordings. My personal favorite recording of the concerto is with Mstislav Rostropovich as soloist. For the Prokofiev, I recommend Nema Yervi's recording with the Royal Scottish National Orchestra. In particular, Prokofiev's Fifth Symphony is a great example of how music, history, and politics are interconnected. The same is also true in the United States. The performing arts affects politics, and politics affect the performing arts. And so, as we consider what the next 250 years might look like in this country, we should also consider what role we hope the arts will play in American society moving forward. To that end, I'd like to close today's pre-concert talk with a few words about where the Aspen Music Festival and School fits into this conversation. We serve and collaborate with many constituencies, including guest artists, organizational partners, faculty, students, board members, and other administrative staff, but equally important, we are here to serve you, our audience. We want you to feel welcome when you come to our performances, and we hope that you feel like you're part of a community. We believe that you should have the opportunity to hear music by a variety of composers, performed by artists with a variety of backgrounds over the course of a summer. As such, it is our responsibility to be sure that you hear the work of good composers whose music hasn't been performed often enough, balanced with the great war horse pieces that never get old. It matters to us that you feel comfortable talking to us about your concert experience. Our long-term success depends in large part on having a strong relationship with you. Which is my long way of saying thank you for coming today. That concludes today's Prelude Pre-concert talk. We hope you enjoy the concert, and I'll see you at the 10.